welcome back. So now we're here with Adam Bach, who's here from Kongernes Jelling, where you are curator. And I just need to tell the people on Zoom, if you have a question, you have to click on the Q&A button thingy, because we don't see it if you raise a hand. And yeah, that's like the only way, so do that. So yeah, I'm just gonna let Adam talk, and you have your own microphone, so everything is good. And,
yes, I do.
Welcome, Adam.
Thank you very much. Yes, as was just mentioned, my name is Adam. I'm the curator at the museum called Kongernes Jelling, which is a very Danish title. So we gave it a surtitle, which is Home of the Viking Kings. Recently now, though, most of our research is going on Tyra, which is the first queen of Denmark. So maybe we'll have to figure out how we integrate that into the name Kongernes Jelling, which means the King's Jelling. This is a picture from our exhibition. As you can see here, it's quite a lot going on. The reason why I took it, brought it along, is because it's a great picture for one thing, but also it gives you an impression of the theme that we're working with at the museum. Not only the expression we have at the museum, because all pictures at the museum in the exhibitions are made by the same artist, a German artist who's actually a tattoo artist. But he made all of these pictures, so it's the same sort of, what's that called, sort of aesthetic through the entire exhibition. It's not, even though every room is different, has its own theme, all the pictures are in the same hand, you could say. That gives it a nice, thorough, sort of wholesome sort of impression when you see the entire exhibition. I named this Storytelling in Jelling. Could also be Jelling telling or something like that, but actually the point is that, well, when I was making this this presentation, my biggest problem was that I couldn't find a good title for it. But I think actually maybe the best title is Bridging the Gap, because that's actually what this is all about. As a museum, we are also a commercial entity, which is an important fact to remember. And when we are discussing how to bridge gaps between, for instance, pure science research and how you actually make money on it on the one hand, on the other hand, how well, there's all kinds of different ways to have to bridge these gaps when you disseminate knowledge of Vikings. As Leah mentioned, it's actually an invention from the 1800s, but it's also something that happened 1,000 years ago. So there's still things we have to bridge. That's why I took on these quotes right here. One is from a colleague of mine from Aarhus University, Sarah Croix, who wrote that as scholars, we have as a mission to disseminate the results of our research as they are, and not in a diluted manner, in order to gather more visitors. She's actually right about that, but she's also very wrong. And the same here is with an old Danish historian and also actually a philosopher. His name was Erik Aarup. He wrote, "History writing is to poeticize over the facts that can be extrapolated from the sources." So on the one hand, we have this positivistic viewpoint that we only need to actually disseminate the pure knowledge that we know and not dilute it in any way. And on the other hand, we have a guy who says that's what we're doing no matter what. And that's also a gap we have to bridge. So we're bridging a lot of gaps. And also, as you mentioned, there is this pure science and research view on a lot of this stuff, which is to work with the source material independently from public demands and opinions. That's very nice. It's also detail-oriented. It's about the artifacts. And it's, for instance, like you mentioned before in the end, that maybe we shouldn't call it the Viking Age because it's scientifically not accurate. Maybe we could call it the Steel Age or the Sail Age or something like this. But I'm sorry, Leah, that ship has sailed. For instance, I just took this along because this is from one of my favorite words or names for a artifact that I came across while I studied archaeology in Aarhus. And that is Spiralplattenfibel mit dreifacher Kreuzbalken-Kopfnadel. That's a very long word. And it's actually just a goddamn brooch. So there is a difference in how you actually talk about disseminate the knowledge that is acquired through painstakingly detail-oriented scientific research, but you also have to tell about it. And you can't do that in the same fashion. So when we talk about public dissemination, of that knowledge, then we actually have to work with the source material in cooperation with the public demands and to nuance those opinions that are out there. That's what we are trying to do at the museum. We're trying to spark an interest. So in that regard, we don't really care how they got that interest, as long as they get to our museum, so we earn some money, but then also so we can actually nuance those views they already come up with, which are a part of the preconceptions, the prejudices, and all that stuff. So for instance, research is detail-oriented, dissemination is about the big picture. It's about the artifact in the research. I would argue that in the dissemination of that knowledge about the artifact, it's not the artifact that's interesting in itself, it's the story that it's a part of. And that's, especially this one, the artifact or the story is one of the major discussions within museums and dissemination of scientific knowledge at museums is it the artifact that is the story, or is it the story that the artifact is a part of? That's interesting. And I would argue, and our museum in Jelling argues, that it's all about the story. That's what people want to know. If we say that the scientific research in the artifacts is like an iceberg, icebergs are like, it's only 10% that's above water, 90% is below water. We only want the last 10%. We don't need the entire explanation of how we acquired that knowledge. We only want the conclusions. And then it can be an add-on for those who are extremely interested in acquiring knowledge of how we know that. Then, of course, we need to be able to tell that story as well, but it's not something that we are highlighting in the exhibitions. It's the conclusions. So for instance, this is the archaeological name for a small brooch. I think we would just call it a brooch at the museum. Yeah? That's just to sort of put a point on it. I can also say that I myself am an archaeologist, but I'm also bridging gaps because my master thesis was in modern dissemination of knowledge, and I wrote a master thesis on American football. So again, we're bridging a lot of gaps here. Also, when we are talking about the story in Jelling, it's also because we are pretty void of artifacts in Jelling. So that it was pretty easy for us to say, well, we're not going to concentrate on the artifacts. We're going to concentrate on the story behind the artifacts, mostly because we don't really have any artifacts in Jelling. We have big monumental constructions, but not many artifacts. So it's a pretty easy conclusion for us to draw at our museum. This is old-fashioned dissemination of scientific archaeological knowledge. This is from what's now called the War Museum in Copenhagen. It's also part of the National Museum as we are. It was called Tøjhusmuseet in olden days. And here you see lined up something like maybe 400 rifles from some time in the 18 or 1700s. I would argue you don't need to exhibit 400 rifles. You would need 400 rifles to do archaeological or scientific research in the small details of the differences between them, but you don't need to show 400 rifles. You only need to show maybe one or two. And that's what we're doing in Jelling, where we have, of course, not many artifacts. We don't have 400 we can show, but we are doing it in a different way, where we actually use animations. These are 5 or 6, as far as I remember, it's 6 different artifacts that we have from the grave chamber in Jelling. I should have maybe started off by saying that in Jelling we have some runic stones. It's a pretty famous place because of that, with Harald Bluetooth and the beginning of the state, of the nation state of Denmark, and also the conversion from pagan to Christian faith in Denmark, officially at least. So it's a pretty important place, and it's always on the what's that called, the tests to see if you can become Danish citizen. There's always the question about the runic stones in Jelling, always. I ace that one every time. Anyway, what we have here are some few artifacts. There's one artifact in there, one in there, and one in there. And what we do is that we use animations to actually tell the story of that artifact, how it was used, and so on and so forth, without any text at all, almost. That was one of our main points when we started, or we built the new exhibitions in Jelling, was as little text as possible, because we wanted to be accessible not only for scholars or people who already know a lot, or all those old-fashioned museum guests who always want to walk around with their hands on the back and read things. We want more people to come and visit us, because we're also a commercial entity, which is also very important to remember. So what we did is that we did these animations, and they're actually from a very old-fashioned technique called Pepper's Ghost. That was what the old magicians in the 1800s used, this technology for when they had to sort of make an elephant disappear and stuff like this. It was all with mirrors and glass and stuff like this, and that's the same technology we're using, just in a different, more modern context. So right here we have one of our artifacts, which is a small wax candle that we found inside the burial chamber in the northern mound. And if we just exhibited the small wax candle and then some text on top of it, it looks like an old fossilized turd. It really does. But by putting on animations in the background like this, you can actually now see that it's a candle, and the light right here is an animation, of course. And then that animation sort of goes on until the light goes out by itself, and then it starts over. We do that with all our artifacts, and that's because we don't have many. We can do this because this is costly. If we were to do that with 400 rifles, that would be extremely expensive. So it's a luxury we can afford because we don't have many artifacts, but then on the other hand, we can show those artifacts in a way more pleasant way, I would say. So that's some of the stuff we're working with in Jelling. The other thing about Jelling is that we are also part of the UNESCO World Heritage. We're the first place in all of Denmark that became part of the UNESCO family back in 1994, which also means that we have more responsibility in order to disseminate the knowledge we have, not only about the Vikings and not only about the nation state building of Denmark, but also about the core values of UNESCO, which is education, freedom of speech, democracy, protection of cultural heritage, which is one of the main reasons why UNESCO World Heritage was made in the first place, to avoid stuff like that. And that was, of course, after the Second World War, where everything was bombed to shit. But especially this part over here is also very important. So we have some values that we have to adhere to, which makes the place in Jelling and the dissemination of the knowledge we have in Jelling, in my opinion at least, way more important than we just think. It's not just because I love Vikings that I think it's important that I tell the story about the Vikings in Jelling. It's because we're also World Heritage. We're actually trying to also bring out some core values. And that's when we get political, actually. And that's very dangerous in archaeology. Like you also mentioned, one of the main reasons why German archaeologists have not made any sort of flamboyant theories for the last 80 years is because it was a German archaeologist who invented the idea of the Aryan race, which Hitler then, we could say, used pretty well in some fashions. Well, he overused it also. So the whole thing about doing archaeological theories is the fear that they will be misused by politicians. That's a very, very big thing. And you can always see, because archaeology is actually a political entity in itself. It was invented more or less so you could find some sort of justification in why you were in that area that you were. So for instance, archaeology in Northern Africa was predominantly made by the imperialists who were down there invading the area in the 1800s. So it's like the French and the English and the German and stuff. Today, archaeology in the North African region is made by their own locals, which also means their focus is on something else. For the French archaeologists, for instance, in Northern Africa, they were only looking for Roman remnants, because the Romans were like the French down there occupying the area. But now in Northern Africa, they're only looking for the local population back in those times, the Berbers. So it's always political. So instead of trying to avoid it, we try to, let's say, at least halfway control that narrative. And I have lots of examples of that. For instance, I was in the radio once because a politician from Dansk Folkeparti, he started talking about how a German treasure that was just found should come to Jelling because it belonged in Denmark and it was part of Harald Bluetooth's treasure and it should go to Jelling. And I had to go out on radio and say, well, that's all nice and dandy, but let's just say that the treasure should stay in Germany because it's actually more interesting to learn about how borders were not the same back then we should just bring everything to Jelling because some right-wing guy thinks so. So we need to always be aware of those traps that are out there, political traps, but we still also have to acknowledge that what we are doing is part of a political process. So anyway, I think that the story is more important than we can imagine, and there's more at stake than we think. Which also means this is our conclusion in Jelling, at least, that we by any and all means need to tell that story that we have, because it's that important. Which also means poetic license can be justified, lying cannot. And that's not just something that we invented, that's actually also what Harold Bluetooth did. He also embellished the truth. This is also propaganda. This is also a political statement. And it's a fantastic stone. I love that stone. I'm not going to talk about it, even though I would like to, because then we're going to be here for a week. But we are standing on the shoulders of others who have done the same. The same goes for the entire monument area, actually, and also the way that we talk about it. Here we have the two runic stones on a nice picture. They were encased in glass in 2011. And you also talked about horns and helmets. We're very, very aware of horns and helmets also in Jelling, but we don't mind them. There's a fantastic example. There was a few years ago, there was a small kid who walked around in a helmet like this, and there was a big Viking market in Jelling, which was not a part of our museum, but we sort of cooperate with with these guys who make the Jelling or the Viking market in Jelling. And they saw this little kid with a horned helmet, and one of the reenactors at the market, she yelled at him, and she said, "Get that hat off, that's all wrong." And it turns out the guy was autistic and had all kinds of mental problems, developmental problems, and he was devastated. So much so that his mom wrote us the next day and said, "We had this really, really terrible experience." And of course, we apologized, and I talked to the people from the market. They were also very, very sorry about what had happened. And we got a hold of the lady who had yelled at him, and we established contact. He came back, and I sent this picture to them because he shouldn't feel alone. We have a lot of people there going around with horned helmets in Jelling, and we don't mind it because it's all about sparking the interest. Even though, of course, we know that this is wrong, it's still, they're showing interest, and that's important. Then when we can always nuance that interest, we can always say, it's great with those helmets because it's a great brand, but did you know that they actually didn't have it? So we're talking a lot about bridging gaps between, for instance, poetic license and then outright lying or fake news. This is a picture of my daughter, Alma. This is a crocheted Viking helmet with horns. Is that poetic license or is it fake news? You could ask. My question, or what I would actually like to ask is, does it matter? She loves it. She loves Vikings now. The interest has been sparked. She is very aware that horned helmets were not a thing of the Viking times. But then, of course, we can always nuance that because, as you mentioned, there are actually samples of some small figurines where Vikings have horned helmets. It might actually not be horns, but it might actually be birds. But anyway, my question is still, does it matter? She loves it. Same with this stuff. Is this poetic license or is it fake news? Or does it actually matter? This is a picture of, that's a great guy. This is from the Shetland Islands, or is it the Orkney Islands? I'm not quite sure. They have a great Viking festival there every year called Uphelja. And every year they choose a new guy from the island to become the chief of this festival. And they actually have to buy their own armor and helmet, and it always looks the same, and it's extremely expensive because it has to fit them and all that stuff. And this is, oh my God, it's so wrong. But does it matter? They are celebrating their Viking heritage in the way that they like. I don't mind. Same with this guy right here. This is from the NFL team Minnesota Vikings. They're also celebrating their heritage, even though that heritage is pretty dubious, but they're still celebrating it. They're called Vikings. They love Vikings, everything Viking, everything Northmen and stuff like this, even though they didn't ride bicycles or have horned helmets, but still, it's sparking some sort of interest. And the same, let me bring you back to the picture I showed you in the beginning. Is this poetic license or is this fake news or what is it? In my opinion, this of course is not fake news because we have actually put in some of the research parts of what I talked about in the beginning, the details and all that stuff, and we put it into this picture, but we still put in it put it in a way that we could say that there's a lot of poetic license involved, at least. For instance, the palisade that was surrounding Jelling back in the Viking times, one of the biggest single constructions ever made by Danish Vikings, we know that it was burned down. So it's okay for me that we make a picture where it's burning. Also, the Jelling stone, it didn't stand right there back in the Viking times, but it's a part of the picture. The houses are correct. Well, they are called Trelleborg house types. I don't know if there's any archaeologists here. But Trelleborg house types, they're called because the first time they found houses like this was at Trelleborg, one of the ring castles of Harald Bluetooth. But the houses in Jelling are slightly different. They're actually prototypes to the Trelleborg house type. I'm getting nerdy about this, I'm sorry. And they're made 15 years prior to any of the other houses that we know of. So they should actually all be called Jelling house types, just so you know. Anyway, they are correct. Also, we know they rode horses and they sailed. So we just put that in there. Also, the story in Jelling is that actually Harald Bluetooth escapes out of the country after a revolution, probably also wounded. That might be him. That's up to you. And also we know that the son who instigated or was a part of the revolution, who became the next king, Sven Forkbeard, after becoming king, amassed a huge armada of ships and sailed off, especially to England, to invade that stuff. That might be him. It's up to you. So that's at least poetic license. As I wrote underneath also is, by using drawings and animations, we underscore the fact that there is interpretation involved. That's very important to us. That's why we don't use reenactors. We don't use pictures of real people in Viking clothes, because you can never do that authentically anyway. It's still an interpretation. They didn't have the straight teeth that we had today. They all that stuff. We can't ask people who wants to reenact as Vikings to, get 14 teeth pulled out, for instance, or something like that. That would be weird. Anyway, this is how Jelling is looking today. It's actually more or less one big modern art piece in white concrete. All the stuff you can see around here, all that stuff in there, those are all representations of scientific facts. We made a huge excavation in Jelling from 2007 till 2012, more or less. It's called the Jelling Project, where we found all that stuff that is now shown in white concrete out in the monument area. It is an interpretation. It's an artistic interpretation. Is it poetic license or is it fake news? Again, I would agree this is poetic license, but it's not fake news because it represents exactly the scientific facts that we know of. So we're working with this thing in Jelling where we're bridging the gaps all the time between the new and the old, between commercial enterprise and dissemination of scientific knowledge. Everything is up in the air and everything is a mixture. And also, that was what it was for Harald Bluetooth. Now I could get on talking about how Harald Bluetooth in his architecture and with his stone all the time, very, very determinedly and also on purpose, is mixing his different symbols, the old Nordic traditions and cultural traditions and architecture. He's mixing that with the modern European Christian one. So the story in Jelling is actually a big story of integration between two different cultures. That's something the guy from Dansk Folkeparti doesn't like to hear. But that's actually what this is. And by integrating these two different ideas, the old and the new, he actually excels in how he propels the nation forward and actually becomes one of the major superpowers in Europe shortly after Harald Bluetooth makes all these changes. So he's like, I'm on the way out on a sidetrack here. I'm going to stop myself because I timed this before I came here. It took an hour. I was supposed to take 45 minutes, so I'm in a hurry. So here we have some reenactors. I just talked about it, so I'm not going to go so much into detail because there's actually not that much wrong with these pictures. It's poetic license, but I wouldn't say it's fake news. But I wrote something down here, which is something I just want to shortly get into. You were actually also into it with the whole toxic masculinity and stuff like this. There was a survey done in Sweden some years ago where this lady looked at all the old exhibitions in Sweden, from north to south in Sweden, looked at all the different exhibitions, especially those disseminating knowledge about Vikings. And she found out some pretty interesting stereotypical renditions of how life was. For instance, men were always standing up outside. while women were always sitting down inside. There was a definite gender difference here. Men were always filled with agency, they were always important looking, they had weapons, and they were always on the way somewhere, doing something great. While all the women were always sitting down, fiddling with stuff. At home, they were sewing or they were doing stuff like this. And it might not be wrong, it might also not be right, but it's definitely upholding some stereotypes that's how you always see them. Men were always taller, women were always lower. I don't like that fact, by the way, because I'm not that tall. So what we did in Jelling was that we were actually aware of this. So one of the most important or most famous pictures we have from our exhibition in Jelling, it was actually portrayed in the New York Times when we opened. This guy, sitting down and fiddling. And when we portray two of the main antagonists in Jelling, which is Gorm the Old, the first official king of Denmark, and his wife Tyra, those were the founders of the Jelling dynasty, which is actually, well, let's gloss over all the details once more time, look at the big picture. It's more or less the same royal dynasty that we have today. The queen we have today is 29 times removed granddaughter of Gorm the Old, officially. This is Gorm and Tyra. Gorm is sitting down, Tyra is standing up. She is the one with agency. And that's also because Tyra is an extremely important woman who, without her, there would have not been a Jelling dynasty. And I'm not just talking about that then there wasn't going to be any kids born. It was actually because she was, in my opinion, the great politician of the time. She was educated for it, whereas he probably just was more good at sailing and hitting people with swords and stuff like that. So this is some of the stuff that we're working with. We are aware of those sort of difficulties in how we disseminate that knowledge without always becoming stereotypical, at least. We're also very aware of, as archaeologists or as scientists, that sometimes we conclude something which is based on a very scarce material. So actually what we also do with the exhibition is that we make certain that in the exhibitions, if there's more than one possible explanation, we say that. We say, it might have been Gorm the Old that was buried in the northern mound. It might also have been Tyra. It might also have been Gorm and Tyra's firstborn son who died, who should have been king. His name was Knut. So we're giving people options. It's all about sparking the interest, you could say. Our exhibition and our museum is not for the scholars, it's for the common man, common woman. Those people who might find it interesting but don't really know a lot about it, they should come in there and not be intimidated of all the knowledge that we're trying to disseminate. And that's what we're doing by that you have to activate stuff. You're pressing buttons. If you want to know more, press a button. If you don't want to know more, just keep on walking. That means that the pressure is less on our guests on, well, in the old exhibitions, you know it yourselves. You see an artifact in a glass case and there's like a book you have to read above it. And you read maybe 2/3 of it on the first one, then you get bored and you go to the next one, then it's the same, you only read half of it, and then you go to the next one, it's the same. You only read the first part, and then at the end you just read like the titles, and then you just keep on walking. That's also why we made the Peppers Ghost thing, because then you avoid that stuff. So as I mentioned, we are not comparing ourselves with other museums, we are a commercial entity, and we are comparing ourselves with our competitors, which we're also actually cooperating with in many regards. Because within 20 kilometers of our museum, we also have Givskud Zoo, which is a major outdoor zoo you can drive through. You can watch lions and stuff. They have a lot of guests every year. We also have Legoland and Lego House, and we also have LaLandia. So we have a lot of big tourist attractions in the area, and we have a lot of families going for these attractions. And we are joining forces with these guys when we do tourist promos in Norway and stuff like this, because what we have experienced is that all the families, they come for this stuff. But once they've spent 3 days doing that stuff, a lot of them, especially the parents, are starting to get a little bit fed up and might want something with a little more substance. But it still has to be entertaining for their kids. That's when they come to us. That's pretty cool. So this is part of this tourist thing. We actually wrote that in there in Danish. It's worth the detour. Because a lot of people, the modern preconception of Jelling is that there's 2 runic stones that's very important for the beginning of Denmark, and everybody should come and see them. And it's a little ways off from the highway or the motorvejen, the way that goes up through Jutland. It takes about 20 minutes to get off that road and back on it. A lot of people come there because they know that they should once they're in the area, and they expect to use 20 minutes just looking at the stones and driving off again. But they don't really know that we have a huge, well, it's not that huge, but it's really, really great museum right there, and it's interactive, it's good for kids and all that stuff. So we're working a lot with all of these different sort of angles for activation of the interest. And in that regard, in 2010, we got a really great gift. Because in the Danish Donald Duck magazine, they actually came to Jelling. That's pretty cool. It's only in the Danish Donald Duck magazine. They actually, in this story from 2010, they go to Jelling. Here's the runic stones. Here's the museum that I work at. So they're driving up that road right there, which is now no longer existent, but that doesn't matter. What is interesting is that this was in the Donald Duck in 2010. We did not open our museum until 2015, well, with the new exhibition. But we knew about this. So we called up Disney Studios in California and said, there is this story. We would love to use that in some fashion at our museum because you're actually visiting it. How can we do this? Can we make it like a special exhibition Donald Duck magazine with that story in it, and maybe also that cool story by Karl Barks back from the 50s where Donald Duck is looking for a Viking golden helmet? It's a great story. If you don't know it, read it. And they said, sure. Can we also put in some pages in the middle where we talk about UNESCO, World Heritage, where we do some more museum sort of dissemination of scientific fact and stuff like that? I said, sure. There's only one catch. You can't sell it. You can't earn money on it. And that's fine with me. What we got is they drew an entirely new front page for a new special exhibition, Donald Duck magazine, that you can only acquire if you come to our museum. And when we had the opening for this new Donald Duck magazine, we had lines outside the museum. We opened at 10. The lines, they were already formed at 8. That was insane. It was like a rock concert at a museum. That was weird. And that was because there were so many Donald Duck enthusiasts. They have like whole clubs and stuff. And we got the news out in those forums. So they all just stampeded the place. Because they wanted the new special edition exhibition, Donald Duck magazine. It's a great way of becoming relevant to new people. Actually, I heard on the black markets, it's about 150 to 200 kroners worth now. And you can come to Jelling and get one. So that's just some of the examples of how we work in Jelling, I would say, using especially all kinds of different forums of storytelling to actually spark that interest that we are so interested in. And there we go with the Assassin's Creed Valhalla, because that was the same. We contacted Ubisoft, and we heard that they were working on a new Assassin's Creed game, which was situated about the whole Viking era and about how the Vikings conquered England. And that was Sven Forkbeard. And his dad was the guy who made everything in Jelling. So that was, of course, obvious that we should do some sort of collaboration with those guys. And they said that, well, that's a great idea. So we actually had the world premiere of that game. That was in Jelling. We had the voice actors come to Jelling. They sat there, signed the autographs and stuff like this. We had all kinds of weird people coming that day too. And some of the greatest ones, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of them. It was two half Danish, half Pakistani guys, I think. They were like 16 or 17. They loved the Assassin's Creed games. And they only came because of the Assassin's Creed game, because we also got some Xboxes in there and put them around the museum. You could sort of book an hour and you could try the game before anyone else. And of course, they wanted to do that. But once they were there, they actually found out the Vikings were awesome, and that the museum was awesome, and the interest for the actual Viking era was sparked in them. They loved that stuff, and they had no sort of background interest in that at all until they came to our place. And that's one of the points. That's why we do this stuff. Also now we are collaborating with Ubisoft in all kinds of different manners, because they do the educational version of all their games as well, where you don't kill people, you just walk around in old Rome or walk around where the game is situated in a historical context. And we're working with that because we're actually doing also some virtual reality animations, sort of. We have a big Viking ship in a barn. We could put a cloth around it and then project up on the sides and use the Ubisoft animations of them sailing, projected up there, and you actually get a really awesome feeling of sailing a ship while it's inside in a barn. That's some of the stuff we're working with. Then, of course, there's a problem with this game, and that's, of course, all the historical inaccuracies. I don't really mind that too much. It's a poetic license, or is it fake news, and does it really matter? For instance, we all know, more or less at least, that it was the Danes who conquered England. Well, on the other hand, the English called all Vikings Danes, no matter where they came from. But it was Sven Forkbeard who officially was the one who conquered it at the end. All the Vikings in this game come from Norway. And that might be a slight problem, you could say. I can understand why they chose it, because in Denmark we have flat heath land. Looks really, really boring in a game. Whereas in Norway, they have these awesome fjords, which are also World Heritage because they're so beautiful, with steep sides. It looks awesome in a game. So I can understand why they chose to situate it all in Norway instead of Denmark, because it just looks better. But once we had this day, we also had like a whole presentation, a discussion. I talked with the guy who voiced this guy. His name is Magnus Brun, I think it is. We had a whole discussion about this in the museum in front of the live audience, but the radio was also there. So in that regard, we actually got the more correct knowledge of what actually happened disseminated out through this. So this sparked the interest, and then we could sort of mediate it or work with it and make it more correct in some fashions at least. I'm talking. Anyway, I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit. We're working with chronic relevance in Jelling. We're trying to spark that interest, and we're doing that in every way possible, always trying to think outside the box. So we have a special exhibition room right over here. The entire permanent exhibition is on the other side. So when last summer, we knew, of course, we had known that for many years, the Tour of France was going to go through Jelling, right down this road right here. So we were going to try to spark that interest of the cyclists and also try to get into international media and stuff like this. So we did a special exhibition where we compared Harold Bluetooth and his ego with the egos of the greatest cyclists of the Tour de France history. And we called it Harold Bluetooth in the yellow jersey. And it was mostly for fun, but there was also a lot of knowledge disseminated through it, especially our view of how Harold Bluetooth actually operated, you could say. And then, of course, we found out that they were cycling down this road through our monument area, through the entire World Heritage site, and it was only 2 meters and 7 centimeters from our museum. So, of course, we got a hold of a guy who was exactly 2 meters and 7 centimeters long, and put him down on the ground. And took a picture of it so we could say we're about the size of a man apart from the Tour of France. And also we made a small hashtag that we tried to trend. This is it right here. It's a very stupid long hashtag. That was the funny part about it. It's in Danish and in French. And this is Jørgen Leth, one of like a legend in Denmark, standing with it. We also got the director of the Tour de France, Prudhomme, we got him to stand with it. We got the French ambassador to Denmark to stand with it. We also got the Crown Prince to stand with that log, with the enormously long hashtag called probably that museum that has been closest to the Tour of France. I'm going to say it in Danish right here. Nok det museum, der nogensinde har ligget tættest på Tour de France-ruten, lige bortset fra Louvre. So our hashtag, we got it translated to all kinds of languages. We were probably that museum and that UNESCO site that was closest to the route of Tour de France ever, except for maybe Louvre in Paris, because they actually wrote straight through that once. So that's some of the ways we're trying to become relevant in new settings, you could say, and exploiting whatever situation comes up near us to become chronically relevant. Because we don't have a promo or PR budget. This is the way we get our promo and PR out, you could say. And I got more examples of this. This is two fighters or fencers from the Danish national team in fencing. And we got the whole entire national team in the Danish national team in fencing. We got them to Jelling for a 2-day workshop we called the Jorvik Viking Boost. So we actually explained to these fencers what Denmark is, because the whole point is they're going out into the world at international competitions and they're representing Denmark. It says Denmark on the backs of them. Her mask is actually the Danish flag. So their coach actually found that if you sort of build on top of only your own personal gain in winning, if you can build on top of that with something that is more important than yourself, and you can get the athletes to understand this, they might actually do better. Maybe just give it 2% more than they otherwise would. So we helped in this. We explained how Vikings trained and disciplined themselves. We explained how Vikings knew that their destiny was predetermined. They couldn't control if they lost or won. But what they could control is how they met that end. All that stuff. And that was very exciting for these people. They were also doing mindfulness at the rooftop terrace and stuff like this. It was a great couple of days. So we're actually working right now on getting all the national teams of Denmark past to get the Jelling boost before they go out into big competitions. It's a work in progress. I'm almost done. One more thing that we're doing is as many cooperations with other people as we can. For instance, we had some cooperation with these two sites down here. They just recently became World Heritage as well as we are, and they're also related to Harald Bluetooth. This is the great trading town for the Vikings called Haitabu, or Hedeby, and right next to it also Dannevirke. Both of these were also very, very important to Harald Bluetooth. They are now in Germany though. They should have been in Denmark, but they are in Germany. But they are all part of the story of Harald Bluetooth. So what we did is we got some inter-regional funding so we could do a collaboration, and then we used that funding actually to contact people here in Viborg who are good at drawing stuff and animations and stuff like this. And then we started working on a fictitious story, but it was based on the scientific facts, you could say. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to bridge that gap between scientific research, the detail-oriented, in many regards, really, really boring stuff, at least for the general public, and then try to bridge it with a fictitious story that's about the big picture and all that stuff, so it gets easier accessible. So there's a fictitious story, but almost everything in it has some sort of root in scientific fact. For instance, this is how we actually expect that Dannevirke, this big wall that fenced, that defended Denmark from the rest of Europe, that's probably how it looked. Also, the artifacts are correct artifacts. Also here, this is from Jelling. And this is, I actually hate that picture. It's a good picture in many regards, but there is small, slight details that are irritating to me. And that's the whole point of this entire collaboration. It was painstakingly irritating, especially, I'm guessing, for the animators, because every time they made something, we would be an expert from Haitabu, German expert, and another German expert from Dannevirke, and then me here in Jelling. We were always on their backs. That hood is wrong. That thing is wrong. That wheel is wrong. That shape has to be corrected a little bit. All of this stuff that I could imagine for most animators is irrelevant, but for us extremely important, because without it, none of the stuff we're saying can be construed as actually based on fact. So this is bridging the gap between science and details and then the big picture and the dissemination to the broader public. And we ended up with this, and let me just explain why I hate this picture, because the way that they're raising the palisade in Jelling is more or less correct as far as we know, but there's just one thing. See that guy right here? He's helping along. His angle is really stupid though. And the second thing is the rope he's holding. It goes on the wrong side of that beam right there. So once they get that plank up, that rope is gonna be squished. I can't stand it. And that was too late in the process. Otherwise, I mentioned this several times, and it was like, no, it's too late. We already colored it in. We can't afford to make a change now. And that's also one of the realities that we have to live in. There is economic and time issues that we have to adhere to as well. Not everything can be as perfect as we want it, but it can be close. So let me just end up here by showing you the small video. You can actually also see some pictures of it right over there, and also right here. You're pretty good at showing it off here. That's nice. So let's try to see if this works. It's a 10-minute animated video made here in Viborg with the help from us. I still found lots of factual mistakes in that thing, though. But again, I hope it sparked an interest. It took a lot of time because there were so many details in there, and still there's things that they got wrong. For instance, Jelling did not look correct. It was not rompig enough. And also the wagons looked a little bit like prairie wagons from the cowboys in the West, stuff like that. There's small details like that, but all in all, I think it's a great example of how we can actually get things done when we work together, and also if somebody gives us money to do it for. But that was more or less it. Any questions?
Can I ask? Do I have a microphone?
Oh, yes. She's running up to you now.
She's turning on the lights.
So we're from the animation workshop. We are going to be animators and designers. We're going to make films for children, for adults. So do we have a Viking helmet pass now?
Nope. That was one of the things that irritated me here, because there was way too many helmets. Helmets were not something that you really had in the Viking times. We've found 2 or 3 in Scandinavia. Iron was extremely expensive, and only the absolute top of the society had helmets. Are you asking if you have poetic license to put horns in helmets?
Kind of, I guess.
Well, it's up to you, I would say. Depending on what kind of animation you're doing and who you're doing it for. If it's for small kids, if it has to be easily discernible and decodable, then I would put horns in it. We have horns in some Vikings helmets at the museum because we have the hand dryers made by Dan Dryer, and their logo is a small Viking with horned helmets. So we can't avoid them, I would say. But of course, I would rather that you would do it the correct way, but I have total understanding of what sort of animations you have to do and how easy it has to be discernible for others.
So as a follow-up question to that, on a more serious note, we love the helmet because it's easily distinguishable. It's like put an eye patch on someone, you have a pirate. Put a Viking horned helmet, you have a Viking. So what alternative visual language do you recommend, especially for people like us who don't have this knowledge, who make these mistakes, who hear, and then Gudrun went to that place on a wagon, and then we Google wagon and we find the thing that looks the most Viking, right?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of problems with that. I don't know how you would make something as easily decodable as an alternative to the horned helmet. I wouldn't come up with any good answers. I would guess put him on a ship, first of all, and probably also one with a sail where it's red and white striped. Not because it's a Danish one, but that's more or less always what you see, even though we don't know if that's true at all. But again, it depends on who you're trying to make an animation for. If it's for grown-ups, I would definitely lose the horns. If it's for kids, put them in there.
Thank you.
As long as it sparks an interest for my museum.
Good point. Yes.
Remember, this is about dissemination of scientific knowledge. This is not about how we do science. Because it's very important that we are aware that there were no horns in helmets when we are archaeologists. But when we tell about it and show about it in the public, it's a little bit different story. That's my point. Yes?
Yes, hello. I have a question regarding design and what you said about poetic license and fake news and stuff. I'm a reenactor for the Viking Age. So, and I'm sure you're very familiar with, like you said, with your story that people could be very elitist about that, and if someone doesn't know it's really true, it's a really big problem. Like with linen, you have to make it by hand and not have it machine woven. Anyway, I'm just thinking that in the reenactment community, there's not a lot of creative freedom. There is a set amount of patterns. If you want to be specific, you can't even wear a sack as a Viking Age person. And I'm just wondering, how do you, like, what's the process of figuring out what you can put figures in on the pictures you have? And by the way, the Jelling Museum is my favorite museum in the whole world.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I'm super happy.
Well, you're asking about something that is a very, it's a sore thumb, you would say in Danish or something like that. It's a problematic thing because textiles, we don't have many of those. We don't really know what they look like. The National Museum has just gone through a very big process, a scientific research project, where they tried to reconstruct the clothes from the Mammen grave, which is updated to around 970 something, I think, which is, we're thinking it's one of Harold Bluetooth's earls or something like that. And his clothes or his textiles were more or less there in some small parts at least. So they reconstructed that. That took them like 4 years. And they got one set of clothes out of it. And it looks okay, in my opinion. It's probably authentic. I'm not a textile guy. I'm more about like the big picture, the politics and what was the changes that it affected and all that stuff. In my opinion, there is some, especially within the reconstruction and reenactment thing, especially dating back to the 70s and 60s, where you started reconstructing Viking houses and stuff like this, where they, in my opinion, made like a huge, like a cardinal mistake, more or less, which was they made everything brown, wood-colored. It wasn't. As archaeologists, we just don't know, because what we find is post holes in the ground, so we know how it looked at ground level. We have actually no real idea of how the roof looked or anything like that. We get better impressions with more archaeological finds and stuff, but there's this common misconception that everything was wood colored in Viking times. It was not. They loved colors. And we have done a lot of research into the colors that the color scheme that they had access to, and all that stuff. But it's very, very nerdy. So I can understand why that within the reenactment community, they say, let's stick to these 6 patterns or whatever, because we know about these. The rest is poetic license. The problem is, in my opinion, that the 5 or 6 patterns you're talking about, they might have already, are filled with poetic license. Yeah. So in my opinion, just go for it. Make something cool. And you can always just be inspired by the style types that we have in the Viking times. They are, we use those as a chronology to date stuff by. So if you know you're going to be reenacting a Viking from the 10th century, go for the Jelling or the Mammen style, not Boer or some of the other styles, because they are different in time. As long as you keep to that, I would say you're good to go. But that's just my opinion, by the way. Yeah.
So following up that question, also more of like a nerdy question. How far can we cross-reference then based on like writings from the English or maybe other people like, you know, more towards the east, since the Vikings traveled all over, right? So how far can we cross-reference to fill in those gaps that, like, for example, about textiles or constructions that they had and so forth?
More than I would like is the fast answer, I would say. You also asked Leah about this before, why there was so much going on with our attention going towards the Vikings going to the west, not to the east. There's also, well, one thing is that the British Isles were the Xerox machine of the Middle Ages. Every text was sent to England and they copied it over there. So 9 out of 10 written sources we have come from England. That's one of the reasons why the attention is going so much that way. The other thing is the political atmosphere in the world in the 20th century closed off the entire eastern side. So there's a lot of information we just never got until recently, and now they're closing that shit up again, by the way. Sorry for swearing. That's why it was so important to get that Rus exhibition done. It was actually in the making for several years. They were about to make it when Russia invaded Crimea in 14, for instance. So it's been going on for a long time trying to get artifacts and tell that story. But the political climate just makes that too hard. When you want to correlate written sources with what we actually know archaeologically, then we're getting into a gray zone, I would say. Traditionally in Denmark, in understanding the 10th century Viking age in Denmark, we have some written sources. Adam of Bremen is one of the most important ones. A huge liar. Saxo, one of the first historians of Denmark, when he writes about this period as well, huge liar. They all are spin doctors. It's all fake news, and they're all trying to put it into a context of their own presence. Which means that you can't ever believe any of those stories, except we're starting to correlate those stories with archaeological finds. And in those regards where we can actually see, for instance, well, Saxo or Adam of Bremen says something about Gorm invading Haithabu around 936, then we find some runic stones that are approximately from that area, where there is a woman, a mother, who has made a memorial stone for her son, Sigtrygg, who was the king of Haithabu, and he must have died at that point. So it sort of makes sense. So in that regard, we can sort of say that might be true. And also, it's the same with all the myths written down by Snorri in Iceland. It's 200-300 years after the fact, but it actually turns out that a lot of those stories that he writes down can be correlated, at least slightly or partly, by archaeological evidence. And in that regard, it gets very interesting. But we always have to remember that every written source that's written down is written by Christians about someone who was not Christian, which means we have to sort of shave off all that, the layers of patina that's on top of what we could call the facts. It's a lot of work. Yeah. Was that sort of answering your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I like to talk. I don't know if you noticed.
One last question. I think you have to run off.
Yes. Well, you talk about poetic license as a museum to like appeal to the common people. So so I was wondering how you feel about the Jim Lyngvild exhibition at the National Museum in Copenhagen, because that has been discussed.
I could imagine
how
it has been discussed nationally for a long, long time, ever since he did the exhibition. I would probably not have chosen to do as my top boss, Rane Willerslev, chose to do. I would not have done it that way, but I can understand why, because it's also a commercial entity. And even bad press is good press. It was one of the most visited exhibitions in recent years in the National Museum in Copenhagen. What I don't like about it is Jim Lyngvild's private commercial enterprise that we as the National Museum, which are, we are sort of the, what's that called, the pillars of scientific fact. Even though we're also a commercial entity, what happened is that Jim Lyngvild also has a lot of skin lotion products that he gets made in Russia somewhere that by kids or whatever, and he actually gets to sell those. So he earns money and credibility by us sort of giving him the stamp of approval. So in that regard, I don't mind that you bring in people from the outside who are not scholars or who are good at any of that stuff, but they're just a popular name, for instance, because you can get more attention into it. What I don't like about it is when that guy actually, his own commercial enterprise wins on it. I think Rane and the National Museum in Copenhagen were maybe a little bit naive when they did it. But other than that, I think that the media explosion about it was way bigger than it needed to be, because the exhibition was not that bad. It was pretty bad, but it was not bad in that regard. They just took all the best artifacts from the Viking times and smashed them into a small room, and then in the antechamber to that room, they had smashed out all of Jim Lyngvild's weird pictures of weird Vikings that didn't exist. So they sort of separated those two, but it was a bad exhibition, but it just got so much press. So in that regard, it was a great success. Yeah? Again, it's about bridging the gaps, and sometimes it's done better than other times. Jim Lyngvild also made an exhibition at Kronborg, which is very good.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Adam.
Yeah,
That was
thank
really
you.
great.
Thank you. Thank you.